Welcome to a deep dive into U.S. politics. You've given us a ton of research, and it sparked some really interesting questions about how political ideologies are changing in this country.
Yeah, you're diving into a really dynamic time in U.S. politics.
It seems like everyone's talking about the growing divide between liberals and conservatives, and you want to understand what's really going on, especially when it comes to gender and age.
It's not just about the labels, though. It's about understanding how people's values and their experiences shape their political views.
Exactly. And your research suggests that there are some fascinating shifts happening beneath the surface.
Yeah.
So let's start with the big picture. The Gallup research you sent paints a pretty clear picture. The U.S. leans center, right?
Okay.
36% of Americans identify as conservative, another 36% as moderate, and 25% as liberal.
Now, that might make it seem like things are pretty static, but if we zoom out and look at the trends over time, that's where things get interesting.
Okay, let's unpack this. What kind of trends are we seeing?
Well, while conservatism has remained pretty stable, the percentage of self-identified liberals has actually been growing since the 1990s, and the real change is happening in the middle.
You mean the moderates?
Exactly. That moderate middle ground is shrinking, which suggests that people are feeling less inclined to sit on the fence and are taking more defined ideological stances.
So fewer people are identifying as middle of the road. That definitely seems to reflect the political climate these days.
Yeah.
Everyone seems to have a strong opinion.
It's a trend that's been building for a while, and it raises a lot of questions about how these shifting ideologies will play out in future elections and political debates.
And it's even more interesting. Your research shows that women, especially younger and older women, are actually driving this shift towards liberal identification. Let's dive into that a little deeper.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Watch them all drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
The U.S. is still considered center-right overall, right? But what this research gets into is what's happening under the surface.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about how people label themselves politically, like whether they consider themselves liberal, moderate, or conservative, and how those labels have been shifting over time.
Right, and it's not just staying the same, it's actually shifting more leftward since the 1990s. But here's the thing, it's not like everyone is moving at the same pace.
Absolutely not. It's certain groups that are driving that change. And the research points to women as kind of the leading force here, especially younger and older women.
It's so interesting. It's like their views are evolving while men's views are staying pretty much the same.
It does seem that way, yeah. And one of the most striking findings is that young women, those aged 18 to 29, have seen an 11-point jump in identifying as liberal since 1999. That means they've gone from 29% to 40% identifying as liberal.
Well, that's a pretty big jump in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, it is. And it really highlights how this younger generation is kind of redefining what it means to be politically engaged.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just the younger generation either. The research also found that senior women 65 and older have also seen an 11-point increase in identifying as liberal. They've basically gone from being the least liberal group of women back in 1999 to matching those younger cohorts today.
It really makes you rethink that idea that people's views become more fixed as they get older, doesn't it?
Totally. So what about the men then? The research shows that they've been a lot more consistent across the board, regardless of their age. What do you think that is?
Well, the data suggests that men's political views have remained fairly stable across all age groups. It's not necessarily that they're becoming more conservative, it's more like they're staying put while women are shifting. And there are a few possible explanations for this. One idea is that men's political attitudes might be more deeply ingrained or less influenced by things like social movements that are resonating with women right now. But, human behavior is complex. There's never one simple answer.
Right. Makes sense. So we see this big difference between men and women, particularly in that youngest age group, the 18 to 29-year-olds. We talked about 40% of young women identifying as liberal compared to only 25% of young men. That's a 15-point difference.
That's right. And that gap is definitely something to keep an eye on as this generation continues to age and gain more influence.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, if these trends continue, how will this impact elections in the future, or even cultural debates and the overall political climate?
A lot of big questions to consider, especially with this generation that seems to be so comfortable with challenging the status quo. So let's talk about those women for a minute. What do you think is driving this shift leftward for them?
Well, the research points to a few possible factors, and I think it's important to remember that it's complex and multifaceted, right? There's no single cause. But what really stood out to me is the idea that major social movements and generational change are playing a big role.
Yeah, that makes sense. Think about it. Younger women today have grown up in a time of incredible social transformation. Movements like #MeToo and the fight for reproductive rights have really become major parts of their lives, and those experiences are bound to shape their worldview.
For sure. And a lot of these movements are focused on equality and justice, which are values that align very closely with more liberal or progressive viewpoints.
Exactly. And in addition to these movements, we can't forget the impact of education. Women are now surpassing men in college enrollment, and there's often a link between higher education and more liberal views.
That's an interesting connection. Why do you think that is?
Well, perhaps it has something to do with developing those critical thinking skills that you get in college, or maybe it's about being exposed to a wider range of ideas and perspectives. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's not just about formal education either. It's about access to information, exposure to different viewpoints, and having the space to kind of question and challenge assumptions.
Absolutely. And then on top of those factors, there are also the economic realities that women face. Things like wage equality and paid family leave. These policies tend to be more important to women, and they're often championed by more progressive platforms.
Right. It's about aligning with policies that directly impact their lives and livelihoods. It makes sense.
And let's not forget about that generational shift happening among older women.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the same senior women from decades ago.
Exactly. They're a new generation with their own experiences and perspectives, and they're entering that age bracket with a different outlook.
Yeah. It's like a ripple effect, one generation influencing the next. And it really speaks to how dynamic political ideology is, especially for women. Makes you wonder, how these trends have been shaped by everything that's happened over the past few decades.
Totally. And there's another piece to this whole puzzle we haven't talked about yet. It's that shrinking moderate middle. It seems like fewer and fewer people are actually identifying as politically moderate these days.
Yeah, that's a trend the research definitely points to. And it's happening for both men and women. But what's interesting is they're not necessarily moving in the same direction.
So it's not just that everyone is becoming more extreme in their views.
Not necessarily. While women seem to be leaning more towards that liberal side, the research shows men are kind of all over the place. Some are shifting left, some are shifting right, and some are staying put in that moderate category.
So it's almost like women are moving into the space left by that shrinking middle ground, while men are a bit more scattered.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it makes you think about the implications for the future of U.S. politics, right? Imagine a future where it's less about compromise and more about navigating those distinct ideological poles.
And how would political parties even adapt to that? Would they try to appeal to these increasingly polarized groups, or would they just double down on their core values and risk alienating a growing segment of the population?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's definitely a fascinating time to be watching these trends unfold and trying to make sense of it all.
For sure. But we got to be careful about predicting the future. There are so many factors that could influence how this all plays out.
Oh, absolutely. Unforeseen events, economic shifts, global dynamics, all of those things can have a huge impact on the political landscape. So while these trends are interesting and they give us some food for thought, we have to be cautious about making any definitive predictions.
Totally.
Yeah.
But even with all that uncertainty, it's pretty clear that American political ideology isn't static, right? It's constantly changing and evolving, and the research we're looking at really underscores that dynamic process.
It does. And it also challenges some of those assumptions we might have about how political views solidify over time. Like that finding about senior women actually becoming more liberal as they get older.
Yeah, that was a real eye-opener. It makes you realize that age isn't the only factor shaping someone's political beliefs. There are so many other things at play: generational experiences, social movements, economic realities.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive. Political ideology is multifaceted and influenced by a whole range of things.
Okay, so we've talked about the shrinking moderate middle and how men and women are moving within that changing landscape. But let's zoom out for a second, look at the big picture. Our source reminds us that despite all these shifts, the U.S. overall still leans center.
Right. Conservatives still make up the largest ideological group in the country.
So it's not like the U.S. is about to make this sudden dramatic shift to the left. These changes are happening gradually and within specific groups.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the U.S. is a huge and diverse country. So these trends might play out differently in different regions and different communities.
It's a good reminder not to oversimplify things.
Yeah.
Even though we can identify these broad trends, there's so many variations across the country.
Absolutely. The political landscape of the U.S. is super complex. It's something to appreciate and explore with a sense of curiosity, rather than trying to fit it into these neat little boxes.
I like that, explore with a sense of curiosity. But before we move on, I want to touch on one more interesting point the research made. It mentioned that the shrinking of that moderate middle has actually created more space for the liberal segment to grow.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating observation. It suggests that as fewer people identify as moderate, there's two main ideological poles, liberal and conservative, they have more room to expand.
So it's not just about people becoming more liberal. It's also about the space opening up for those views to take hold and maybe gain more influence.
Exactly. It really shows how interconnected these trends are. The decline of the moderate middle creates this ripple effect that's influencing the balance between liberal and conservative identification.
It's like a political ecosystem where every shift in one area can trigger these cascading effects on the whole system.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights how dynamic and constantly changing political ideology is in the U.S.
This deep dive has been packed with insights, but I think it's time to bring it back down to earth and talk about what it all means for you, the listener. We've covered a lot of ground, but what are the key takeaways? What should you be thinking about as we navigate this ever-evolving political landscape?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that American political ideology isn't set in stone. It's always in flux, and it's influenced by generational shifts, social movements, economic realities.
So that old idea that as people age, they become more conservative. Maybe not so much anymore, at least not the way we used to think about it.
Exactly. This research shows that age isn't the only factor driving these changes. Generational experiences and social changes are huge, too. And speaking of generations, it seems like women, especially younger and older women, are really at the forefront of this shift leftward.
They are, and they're embracing those liberal views at a much faster rate than men, which could have some big implications for the future of U.S. politics. But as we've been talking about, it's not just about women becoming more liberal. It's also about that shrinking moderate middle, which creates more space for both liberal and conservative views to gain traction.
Right. It's a reminder that the political landscape is really complex and interconnected. It's not a simple equation of one side winning and the other side losing. There are all these different dynamics at play, and understanding those dynamics is key to making sense of it all.
And we can't forget that the U.S. is this big, diverse country. So these trends might play out differently in different places and among different groups of people.
Absolutely. We have to be careful about overgeneralizing and recognize that the political tapestry of the U.S. is full of nuances.
Okay, so we've got these dynamic trends, a shrinking middle ground, and a whole lot of complexity. What's the bottom line? What should our listeners be taking away from this?
I think the most important thing is awareness. Being aware of these shifts, understanding what's driving them, and recognizing how they might shape the future. We're not just talking about abstract political theories here. These trends have real-world consequences for policy, for culture, even for our daily lives.
So it's not just about watching the political game from the sidelines. We're all part of this evolving landscape, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And understanding those forces that are at play can help us navigate the changes more effectively and make more informed decisions about our own political engagement, whether that's voting, advocating for issues we care about, or just having those thoughtful conversations with people who hold different viewpoints.
Well said. And, our source today focused mainly on these big generational changes and social trends. But I think it's important to acknowledge that individual experiences and personal values also play a big role in shaping someone's political ideology.
Couldn't agree more. While those big macro trends paint a pretty compelling picture, we can't forget that each person's political journey is unique.
Totally. Individual experiences, personal values, even major life events can all shape how we form our political beliefs. It's a very personal and individual journey.
And those individual stories often enrich and complicate those broader trends we've been talking about. They remind us that political ideology isn't just about statistics and data. It's about real people grappling with real issues and trying to make sense of the world around them.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
All the different things that can shape a person's political views. It's not just about like what you read or which political party you side with.
Right, way more than that.
It's really about like your life experiences, your values, all the things that make you you.
Definitely. It's
Yeah.
deeply personal.
It is. And I feel like that's something we kind of lose sight of sometimes,
Yeah.
especially in today's political climate where it feels like everything is so polarized.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in all the headlines and the back and forth and forget that there are real people with real lives behind all those statistics and labels.
For sure. So I think these kinds of conversations are so important, taking the time to really explore these trends and figure out what's driving them, but also remembering that human element that's at the heart of it all.
I agree. It's about finding ways to connect and listen to each other and recognize that we probably have more in common than we think.
Exactly. And even though we've been looking at these big, broad trends today, change really starts at the individual level, right?
Absolutely. So how do you think these trends we've been discussing might translate into action for the individual listener?
That's a good question.
What can people do to get involved in a meaningful way?
Well, I think the first step is just awareness, being informed about what's happening, understanding the forces that are driving these shifts, and recognizing how they could shape the future.
So doing your own research, staying informed, talking about these issues with friends and family.
Exactly. And then from there, it's about finding those opportunities to engage with the issues that resonate with you, things that align with your values and your interests.
Right. So that could be anything from voting to volunteering for a cause you care about to even just having those thoughtful conversations with people who might see things differently than you do.
Totally. It's about finding your voice and using it in a way that feels authentic to you, and realizing that even small actions can contribute to a bigger change, creating a more informed, engaged, and hopefully more understanding political landscape.
I love that. It doesn't have to be about these grand gestures or huge political movements. Sometimes it's those small everyday actions that can really add up and make a difference over time.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive today, we encourage all of you listening to keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep engaging with these issues. This is really just the start of the conversation, and we're excited to see where it goes from here.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.